Hi, everybody. I'm Adam Hirsch. I'm really looking forward to presenting to you today and discussing with you afterwards. We're going to be talking about building an integrated data approach to pharma and medical affairs. I find this absolutely fascinating. I don't originally come from medical affairs. So first and foremost, just so you get to know me and who I am, I'm EVP Innovation and Transformation at Chemistry. I've been at Real Chemistry now for 3 years. I'll explain a little bit more about us in just a minute, but I've been in an agency, especially in the digital operations space, for the past 10 plus years. And I guess most famously, I was the first kind of full-time employee at Mashable.com, for those of you who know it. Also, I was a co-founder of Giving Tuesday. So hopefully you know that. If not, definitely look it up after this presentation. So for Real Chemistry, in case you don't know us, you might have originally heard of us as W2O Group. We've been around for over 20 years now. We're focused almost exclusively in the world of healthcare, pharma, and life sciences is kind of where we focus our efforts. But even in just the past 3 years since I've been here, we've acquired over 10 companies across all of these solutions, especially on data and technologies. And so a lot of exciting innovation happening here in this realm, and we'll get more into that in just a little bit. For us, when we're thinking about pharma and healthcare, especially if you're not, originally from pharma and healthcare, there's kind of this bench to bedside type of mindset. But I think when we kind of think about this, really, it's from the beginning of the science, right? How are we and are all of these organizations and research institutes and everyone around the world trying to figure out a solution for an important critical problem with patients or people who suffer from something, right? And so there's clinical trial processes, and then there's all of the commercial ends of what that kind of comes to life, right? Which we all know as, kind of pharma drugs and kind of products there. So it's quite fascinating and kind of how this comes to life. And so for us as an organization, we work end to end, but a lot of today's focus is going to be more on medical affairs and how these products kind of come to life. And for us, we're global. We're very focused on data. It's been a core part of our thesis from our business from day one. As I said, we invest in a lot of data and technologies too, and we've also acquired data and technology companies focused on data as well. And so we're definitely, for us, especially as you'll kind of see, kind of starting to look at all of the core capabilities, not just around marketing and technology, but also under all of the underlying types of capabilities. And for us, as kind of one P&L, one organization, right, we're trying to stitch together all of our clients' work. So ultimately, holistically for the organization, and more importantly for us, as patients or those who might need this type of care treatment, or if somebody in our family might need this care type of treatment, like what do we make sure that this organization is kind of moving patient journeys forward, right, and ultimately solving, for their healthcare issues. And so for us, that's all the way from corporate communications and kind of executive positioning, crisis management on that side to the clinical side, right? And the beginning of kind of patient identification, clinical trial recruitment. How are we amplifying, getting the messages out there? And then once we move into commercial products, something that comes, to through prescription, right? Is how do we educate all of the healthcare professionals or HCPs, if you will? How do we educate all of the surrounding healthcare professionals also around them? The patients or potential patients, their caregivers, their family, their friends, their nurses and physicians. How do we educate all of them on what is the best course for treatment? Is this the best course of treatment? What should you know? How do you make sure that ultimately the patient has the best possible outcome? And then how do we support, especially in ecosystems like the United States, making sure that the path forward is as easy as possible for the end patient, right? Kind of getting to that best possible outcome. And for us, as we look at the data, and this will definitely start to feed into here, right? We as an organization have always been focused on social media data. We're also looking at digital behavior and then real world data. So the actual prescribing behavior of these kind of HEPs, what's in the market, how much it costs in different areas, and the market research too, right? The understanding of the HEPs, the patients, what are their perceptions, what's working, what's not working, how do we better understand, the potential, right, of these products and opportunities that these companies afford. And so for us, when we're thinking through all of that, um, this is the key, right? In every industry right now, it is about proving the value and worth of what their organization does, right? How am I helping to support the organization's larger goals of transforming healthcare in this case, but in another case, selling products, having best customer experiences, having the best events, having the best product for a solution. And so we're always trying to measure the different teams, communications, medical affairs, right? The kind of the marketing team, the sales team, everyone is measured to some degree. But when we look at medical affairs is not allowed to sell anything. They're only allowed to communicate and educate the healthcare professionals who are asking very specific scientific and medical questions about specific diseases. What are the realm of treatments in this? How do these products specifically work? What are the side effects? And kind of the list goes on there, but they can't sell. And so it's all about communication and education through digital experiences, websites, PDFs, presentations, a lot of congresses and events and conferences, if you will. And so when we take all of that information, how do we understand that whole ecosystem that I just discussed to see, is medical affairs ultimately having that impact on a patient outcome? And so for us, that mission, how do we also automate that? How do we bring that to life? What are the different data points here? And so kind of the thesis and vision, if you will, right, is to be able to transform measurement of clinical development and medical affairs impact to optimize organizational activities and improve patient outcomes. So how are we going to do this? Well, for us as an organization, just to prove out the concept, we have a lot of social listening data. And this is where John Snow Labs comes in. When we look at sentiment and entity extraction that we'll talk about a little bit, it's not just about the data, it's about the extraction. Who are these people? What are they saying? Is that positive or negative? How might that be having an impact as we start to integrate these other data sets? And so as then we move, how are they talking on social media? What are they saying about these types of disease states and topics? So just as an example, cardiovascular disease, postpartum depression. So they're having conversations about very, very important topics in the healthcare ecosystem and that are important to a lot of people around the world. And they're trying to share information and knowledge or having debates about these on social. So if that's what they're saying there, positive or negative, well, what are they actually saying when it comes to like scientifically, what are they saying in publications? What are they saying on surveys? What are they saying in terms of what we know their actual prescribing behavior is? They say they're an expert in this, yet at the same time, too, we understand that they haven't really diagnosed or seen a lot of patients with these types of treatments, or maybe they have, and they're actually a transformative, HCP or doctor that we should better talk to and understand how is he doing, how is he treating his patients so well? How are a lot more of his patients having better outcomes than, let's say, some of the other types of cohorts or segments that they might be looking at, and leverage that information and conversation, right, as a kind of advisory board type of approach. And then we get into the impact, right? That kind of real world experience. Once again, we can't measure the sales here. It's the exact like rule that we can't do. We can't tie this to sales, but we can tie this to the behavior. Are our HCPs that we're educating ultimately better supporting their patients? Are their patients then eventually having better outcomes? And so that's kind of the laggard effect too, right? It takes a while when we look at a framework to think about social data, that's daily. Theoretically, could even be pretty real time, right? But then when we get the survey data, now we're talking monthly, and then we talk about the true impact of patient outcomes. That's amazing, right? But that data is not instant, and of course is very much anonymized and aggregate. And so for us, as we talk about the social listening, right, this is where we had to figure out who are we looking at from an HCP standpoint? Who is our kind of baseline of the healthcare professionals out there, the doctors, the medical experts, the clinical investigators, even advocacy and other organizations around those core topics. Once again, take something like cardiovascular disease or even type 1 diabetes, right? How do we take all of those examples and start to understand who's saying what? Then it's about the sentiment, right? How are we stitching the understanding of that? The entity extraction, right, is really important here because, as you can imagine, a lot of these topics are very complex. There's a lot of complexity to these tweets, for example, and there are a lot of different words kind of coming up that we need to now understand in a more automated way. And how do we bring that to life? From there, right, how do we layer on those other data sets? How does that look from a BI and functional standpoint? How do we continue to leverage the entity extraction and sentiment to try to stitch these data sets together to see kind of potential impact or suggested impact of what might be coming? And then how do we tie that together holistically? And how do we also ultimately visualize that? How do we tie those kind of entity extractions and topics, if you will, the categorization of this data, so we can also make that accessible for the end users, the people in the medical affairs team who want to understand how they might be having an impact, what's working, what's not working, how can I ultimately improve my ability to educate our doctors, right, about these topics, so ultimately their patients can have a better outcome. And there's a lot of information that can come here. And so for us, we map this to the client organization and to their medical affairs team, and we will work to ultimately understand all of those pieces of the puzzle that we're talking about. But their strategic imperatives, the SIs, as you'll see there, right, kind of are like, how are they ultimately trying to move their work forward, and what are their core priorities? How are they going to achieve that from the objectives, and what are the core, you know, when you talk about it, it's more about the narrative. It's more about how you actually communicate to HCPs, and that's where a lot of the objectives have come in. But then there's these key value indicators. How are you ultimately providing the value in your education to these HCPs so you can eventually measure kind of impact, right? Kind of rises in positive sentiment, right? More conversations around the heart of the matter, no pun intended, but and ultimately kind of going to, well, what topics and keywords should we be talking about more so the conversation can trend towards ultimately a better impact, right, and outcome for the patient. And how do we look at some of those diagnostic metrics around there? Does it differ by specialty? Does it differ by experience? Does it differ by SOCs, like a site of care or a hospital system? So for example, there's like Summit Medical Group, right, which I as a patient belong to, and you have the opportunity to see that all of the experts that are trained in a certain way, they all work in a certain way. And when you start to think about HCPs, that's a critical point too about where the education comes from and how that kind of comes to life. And so for us, we're taking that then further, right? What are all of those data, details, and topics? How do we organize them? How do we actually tie the sentiments and entities around those sentiments to actually the efficacy of of the education, right? The safety conversations that are happening, the mechanism of action, or how that drug is delivered and ultimately received by your body. How do we look at the clinical trial communications that we need to get out there in those early days, especially, and how do we measure that? And so for us, I know this is a more tech savvy crew, and I'm excited by that. Very often I don't get to talk kind of in the weeds and in the dirt, and so I'm really excited to kind of walk everybody through this. But for us, we all know Twitter, hopefully. So Twitter and their APIs are coming into our environments, right? And we have a unique ontology classification system, if you will, that ultimately connects also those Twitter handles to a lot of these healthcare professionals that were talking about that. This has been a product we've been developing for over 10 years. We've got a lot of rich data kind of around that. And we also enrich that data with a lot of other data sets within our ecosystem. So then we can run those tweets also through the kind of entity model as well as the sentiment model, right? So we can extract and combine all of that data. So then we can ETL it, we can bring it into a staging table, we can move that ultimately into kind of a dashboard fashion, and then move from also data from the client ecosystem eventually, right? And then start to bring that to life. And so getting a little bit deeper for a moment on how this works and the systems there. The hard part here, the yellow sticky notes, if you will, are the hard part. How do we then bring that into our process data? How do we harmonize all of this and ultimately organize this? And I think it's best to explain when you actually see the data come to life, because the way our teams were all able to stitch together was really also more focused on, well, how does it need to be visualized? How do these data sets need to be connected? And ultimately, how do we have one table that becomes transformative across the use cases and factors, as well as harmonized with other data in the future? And so combining this data, right, looking at the streams, the enrichments, combining that, and then we had to look through all of this data, right? This is a complex topic with a lot of scientific and medical terms. We have a lot of experts here, as you can imagine, based on our industry focus on these terms. And so from a strategy standpoint, a medical analyst standpoint, from the data science teams, right? We're looking at all of this data, looking at what's relevant, working with our subject matter experts to then think about like when these data points come to life, what are the clients and their users and use cases going to be looking for, and how do they ultimately, provide what is such a critical output, right? Which is ultimately having a better patient outcome. And so when we bring this all together, this is complex. It is, this is a demo example for us right now as a use case to show today, but plenty of ways I think we all know to map it. But when you bring that together, right, you also have to understand this is not going to happen overnight. This takes a long time. I think it's interesting when we kind of talk about this, especially to our clients and their teams and whatnot. I think it's interesting for all of you to understand too, in terms of like the crawl, walk, run. These things don't happen overnight, as you can imagine, right? There's a lot of processing, there's a lot of strategy, there's a lot of conversations, but ultimately within the time period you can kind of be a little bit more agile, if you will, right? A little bit more kind of rolling the ball with the data, starting to explore, because you're never going to be perfect when it comes to UI UX, especially in a BI environment. There's always going to be stakeholders and stakeholder input, and we want to be very collaborative in the build process with our stakeholders to make sure they understand what we're trying to do, but more importantly, we understand what they're looking to get out of that, so we can best support their organization based on the requirements, and help also evolve those requirements as we all think through this, in how we were going to use in our day-to-day lives. So as I mentioned, I really want to bring the work to life. I'm a big believer in seeing is believing, but also a picture's worth a thousand words, and so let's get right into it. There's a lot of data here. There's a lot of data, unfortunately, obfuscated here as well. There is, as you can imagine, in the world of the data that we're talking about, a lot of PII, not PHI in this case, but PII. And so, for the sake of recording, kind of hit anything there. But that being said, right, you can start to look at some of the data you're seeing here. How do we look at those topics, right? These medical topics, right? In this case, focused around a specific disease state. How do we ultimately look at the volume of those tweets and the themes and sub-themes, right? When we're talking about a class of products, or we're talking about a specific state of diseases, or a specific set of what we would all know as like symptoms. Once again, the safety, how is this being seen or perceived, amongst the HCP community, and what are the topics around that? And then, as you can imagine, these are medical professionals having conversations. There's a lot of medical events, and so a lot of these hashtags, if you will, are very much related either to that disease state, or people unfortunately suffering from that disease state, or stories about people, suffering, or hopefully being helped by, right, for that disease state, and kind of those topics there. And then from there, all of that data is interconnected. So looking at the specific HCPs or authors, looking at who's surrounding that, the positive, the negative sentiment, the scoring, and we have other versions that I won't show on this, but that go a little bit more complex into confidence scores and otherwise, right? As kind of you think about the users, right? There's going to be those users who are less technical, less data focused, but want to be more involved in the data. They want to learn. They want to make more informed decisions. And then there are going to be people, I think, like a lot of us today, who are more technically savvy, and also like love to geek out on the data, love to try every button, like to try to find those needles in the haystack, if you will, right? That I think AI and data opportunities like this kind of eventually provide for us. So when we start to look at like the sentiment data, right, there's so many things we could do. So we have other things, once again, behind the scenes that kind of break this out into much more complexity. But how are you looking at that sentiment around those conversations? Who is saying those conversations? Like what are the different kind of cohorts? Who are those specific authors, right, saying things about our products, topics, disease states, other treatments, what have you? And what are they saying about that? And what are they saying in a maybe even negative light about those types of topics? And how do we better either educate them on where there might just be either gaps in knowledge, maybe misaligned perceptions, and maybe some of the previous education they have done and they haven't learned the latest science about what the best mechanisms of actions are for these patients, or best treatments are for those patients. And so also, when we think about that point beforehand about the SOCs, these kind of systems of care or sites of care, how do we also help there, right? Because as you can imagine, one of these organizations that exist out there, when you train up that organization, you're ultimately affecting not only um, a large number of HEPs, medical professionals, nurses, and practitioners, and making sure that they have the latest science and education based on kind of all of the research out there, right? Once again, they can't sell their product. It's about all of the research around these topics and disease states. And so when you best understand the science and these HCPs are more able to impact the patient outcome, how do we ultimately look at where should we be focusing our time and energy based on positive, negative sentiment, the different conversations that are happening there? How can we learn from those organizations who are doing it right? And how do we help bring that to the other areas not? How do we look at where there's more prevalence of these specific diseases? Taking more, let's say, rare disease versus something as large as, let's say, diabetes, right? This map would look very, very, very different. But as you start to narrow the topics of conversation and the expertise, and from a healthcare professional standpoint and what they're saying, this is where there are just great opportunities to help, leverage those voices of expertise, make sure that the kind of put them up as opinion leaders, and kind of help them share their platform, right? Because obviously, as a doctor, you can only imagine they're always so busy, yet they're also trying to help kind of further the science, right? All for the patient outcome. And for us, as we look at the content, what are they saying? How is it working? What are they talking about? How does that relate to different also contents, right? And by when I mean content here, once again, this is in the medical affairs space. So you can be talking about it, everything from in the United States and the world, like Dr. Phil. Dr. Phil is definitely talking about a lot of these topics that you see here. But there are some also very, very, very top subject matter experts in the healthcare field who've dedicated their lives to these disease states, to the treatments of those. And the content from them could be anywhere from any of the major news stations, any of the major publications, out there. Let's say the New York Times, as an example, like these HCPs are those subject matter experts a lot of times that are being called on for quotes. And when we look at also their day-to-day work as they're kind of furthering education, they're also creating new publications, right? They're having conversations in the ecosystem. And so that's ultimately how we start to understand where, how, what are they sharing? What are they talking about? How can we better, once again, have that patient? And when we look at this activity, it's quite interesting to see, as you can imagine, depending on the topic, who is saying what, right? Because there are some of those doctor celebrities out there that we all either love or hate, and they are saying some really interesting things. And in some cases, it's quite inspiring, and in some cases, it's quite disheartening. But when you start to look at the ripple effect, who is saying what, and how is that impacting others, and how is that ultimately being echoed here from a positive or negative standpoint? How can we understand where there might be misinformation being shared? How can we understand where there's also an opportunity to better inform some of those HCPs, once again, before who are misaligned, or might just not be up to the latest, right, on that education? And how do we also understand, based on those breakouts, which types of HCPs are having which conversations, what are their backgrounds, and how does that ultimately affect, so we can help, once again, improve that patient outcome? So I hope for all of you this was as fascinating for me too. I mean, this is, once again, I don't originally come from pharma. I come from the digital world, and being able to be involved in an industry like this and to be able to work on something, as you can tell, I have a lot of passion and heart for, because theoretically for all of us, this is transformative work. The opportunity to help make sure that healthcare professionals out there and their surrounding support are ultimately giving patients the best possible treatments for their best possible outcomes. And that's why I love coming to work every day. As you can tell too, I'm at a standing desk, so I'm always excited and energized. And I'm excited to have a conversation with all of you. Open to literally any and all questions. I'll answer what I'm allowed to, defer otherwise, and feel free to connect with me on Twitter or LinkedIn. And if you do connect with me on LinkedIn, just let me know what you want to discuss, and I'm happy to kind of make that connection. So yeah, once again, thank you and looking forward to the conversation.